6,000 people. That's how many were trapped inside when Spain closed the gates. 6,000 soldiers, merchants, Jewish traders, Genoese fishermen, and their families crowded onto a limestone peninsula 2 miles long and less than a mile wide, cut off from the rest of the world by the greatest combined military force Spain and France could assemble. 40,000 troops on land, 100 warships in the bay, cannon on every hillside, and on the other side of the line, 6,000 people running low on bread, watching their town get reduced to rubble, eating salt meat and waiting to die or be relieved. They held out for 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days. What followed was one of the longest sieges in British history, a masterclass in how to defend the indefensible, and one of the most spectacular military failures of the 18th century. Spain and France threw everything they had at a rock. The rock refused to move. This is the story of why. Gibraltar is not a place that needs much defending on paper. Nature did most of the work. The rock rises nearly 1,400 feet from the sea, a sheer wall of limestone that dominates everything around it. The narrow strait, the bay, the Spanish coast on one side, the Moroccan coast on the other. Whoever holds Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean. Every ship sailing from the Atlantic into those waters passes beneath it. That single geographic fact made it worth dying for, worth bankrupting nations for, worth fighting over across decades. Britain had taken Gibraltar from Spain in 1704 during a naval assault so audacious it seemed reckless. A combined Anglo-Dutch force simply sailed in and seized it. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 made it official. Spain ceded Gibraltar to Britain in perpetuity. The Spanish crown never fully accepted this, the way you never fully accept a humiliation. Recovering the rock became a dynastic obsession, the kind of grievance that gets passed down through generations of kings and ministers until it becomes less a policy and more religion. By 1779, Spain's moment seemed finally to have arrived. Britain was bleeding. The American Revolutionary War had exploded into a global conflict. France had joined the Americans in 1778, Spain joined in 1779, the Dutch were about to enter the war against Britain in 1780. The British Empire was fighting on 4 continents simultaneously with no major allies. Gibraltar, the great naval prize, was garrisoned by a force of barely 5,000 men. The fortress's defenses had been allowed to deteriorate during the years of peace. The guns were inadequate. The fortifications needed repair. Spain and France looked at the situation and saw a window. They were not wrong about the window. They were catastrophically wrong about the man who stood in it. Lieutenant General George Augustus Elliot arrived in Gibraltar as its governor in 1777, 2 years before the siege began. He was 60 years old, which in the 18th century was genuinely old. He was also one of the most unusual soldiers in the British Army, and unusual in ways that mattered enormously for what was coming. Elliot was a vegetarian at a time when the British officer class lived on roasted meat. He was a teetotaler in an army where heavy drinking was standard. He slept 4 hours a night and appeared to thrive on it. He had been educated at France's finest military engineering college before anyone thought to question the wisdom of sending a future British general to be trained by the French. He had fought in the 7 Years' War, been wounded at Dettingen, raised and commanded a regiment of light cavalry. He was, in short, the kind of man who prepares his whole life for a catastrophe without knowing which catastrophe it will be. When Spain formally declared war in June 1779 and sealed Gibraltar's land frontier, Elliot had already been preparing for 18 months. The guns were improved. The fortifications were strengthened. Supplies had been stockpiled. His garrison of roughly 5,000 men, British regulars, a battalion of Scottish Highlanders, Hanoverian battalions, a detachment of Corsicans, were as ready as he could make them. What he could not stockpile was time, and time, in a siege, belongs first to whoever can stand the hunger. The winter of 1779 hit the garrison like a slow punishment. Spain's strategy was simplicity itself. Seal the land frontier, maintain a naval blockade, cut off all supplies, and wait for starvation to do what artillery could not do quickly. The Spanish were not wrong to think this would work. Starvation has ended more sieges than cannon fire throughout history, and Gibraltar's terrain made growing food all but impossible. There were no fields, no livestock to speak of. The rock produced nothing edible except what could be dragged from the sea. By December 1779, bread was rationed, not reduced, rationed entirely. The garrison received no bread at all unless they were sick or a child. Salt meat and hard biscuit became the daily diet. What little rice existed was distributed in 4-ounce portions. Firewood was so scarce that men burned the salt-encrusted timbers of old ships, pulled from the harbor, wood that barely caught and smelled of brine when it did. Scurvy appeared among the troops, the ancient curse of men without vegetables, bleeding gums, aching joints, teeth loosening from swollen flesh. It was not only the soldiers. The civilian population of Gibraltar, Jewish merchants, Genoese traders, Catholic shopkeepers, the mixed community that had built itself on the rock over 70 years of British rule, starved alongside the garrison. Children got bread that adults were denied. Families burned the same rotting ship timber for warmth. Eliot wrote to London appealing for relief. The replies arrived slowly, if at all. Britain had other fires to tend. Through all of this, Eliot walked the lines every day. He ate the same rations as his men. He appeared at 2 in the morning at posts where soldiers had been standing in the cold for hours, checked their equipment, said a few words, moved on. One officer recorded that Eliot never asked a man to endure something he wasn't already enduring himself, and that this single fact did more for the garrison's nerve than any speech could have. The garrison's morale, through accounts from those who were there, remained stubbornly high through that first winter. In January 1780, the relief came. Admiral George Rodney, who had just won a naval engagement against the Spanish off Cape St. Vincent, capturing enemy supply ships in the process, sailed through the blockade with 21 ships of the line and a convoy of victualers. He arrived at Gibraltar with over 1,000 reinforcements, the captured Spanish stores, fresh provisions, medicine for the sick. The blockade that Spain had considered impenetrable had been penetrated without a serious fight. The garrison ate. The scurvy retreated. They had been given another year. Spanish artillery bombarded the town without pause. A cannonball through a roof, a wall collapsing into a street that had been a street the day before and was rubble by afternoon. Soldiers killed at their posts by shot they never heard coming. The town of Gibraltar, modest houses and warehouses built against the western face of the rock, disappeared section by section. Whole streets were gone. The buildings still standing had their windows blown out, their walls cracked, their roofs open to the sky. People moved into the lower rooms or into the tunnels or pressed themselves against the rock face and hoped the angle was wrong for the Spanish guns to reach them. Eliot ordered that all civilian inhabitants who wished to leave should be evacuated when the next convoy arrived. When Admiral Darby arrived with another massive relief force in April 1781, bringing 29 ships of the line and 100 supply vessels, many of the civilian population departed. Fewer mouths to feed. The garrison could hold longer. The Spanish, enraged by their inability to stop the convoy, bombarded the rock with everything they had while the unloading was underway. 6,000 shells in a single day fell on Gibraltar during the April 1781 bombardment. By some contemporary estimates, buildings collapsed, fires broke out across the town, and the garrison kept working, kept unloading the supply ships, kept returning fire from the heights above. The Spanish exhausted enormous quantities of ammunition and killed relatively few men. The rock absorbed it, as the rock absorbed everything. During the long stalemate, Eliot's engineers carved the rock itself. A sergeant named Ince and his team of military artificers began tunneling into the limestone in 1782, blasting galleries through solid rock to position guns that could fire downward onto the Spanish lines from angles that had previously been impossible. The tunnels were a remarkable feat of engineering under fire. The Spanish were bombarding the rock continuously while men worked inside it, chipping and blasting their way toward positions that would eventually house 17 cannon. A ventilation hole accidentally opened in the side of the tunnel face became the first gun embrasure. The rest were planned around it. Gibraltar was becoming a fortress that grew stronger the more it was attacked. By the autumn of 1781, The Spanish besiegers had been at work for 2 years. They had pushed their forward batteries ever closer to Gibraltar's lines, constructing new earthworks and artillery positions across the narrow isthmus that connected the rock to the Spanish mainland. From these positions, they planned to intensify the bombardment to pulverize the northern defenses until they collapsed. The project was visible from Gibraltar's heights, men and materials moving, earthworks rising, and Elliot watched it with cold calculation. He decided to destroy it. On the night of November 26th, 1781, Elliot assembled 2,264 men. He had selected them personally, drawn from across the garrison, infantry, artillery, engineers. They were given their orders in absolute secrecy. They would march out before dawn, cross the ground between the British lines and the Spanish forward positions, and burn everything they found. Every gun emplacement, every magazine, every piece of Spanish work that represented 2 years of effort. Then they would walk back. They moved out at 2 in the morning, in moonlight, across ground the Spanish had salted with their own soldiers. The formation moved quickly and in near silence, reaching the forward Spanish batteries before the alarm was properly raised. What followed lasted barely over an hour. The British spiked 28 Spanish guns and mortars, destroyed the earthworks, blew the magazines. The explosion of the magazines lit up the darkness for miles. They set fire to everything that would burn. Then they turned around and walked back to Gibraltar. 4 men killed, 25 wounded. The Spanish works that had taken 14 months to construct were gone by dawn. 2 years of earthworks, batteries, approach trenches, ash and spiked iron by sunrise. The garrison walked back inside the lines as the sky lightened, smoke blackened, carrying their wounded, and the men left behind on watch came out to meet them in silence. The Spanish, and now the French who had begun sending forces to assist the siege, needed a different answer. The answer they devised was one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of the century. A competition was held in Paris. The French military establishment, with the wounded pride of a great power that had been unable to take a rock defended by 6,000 men, invited proposals for how Gibraltar might finally be captured. The winning entry came from a French engineer named Jean-Claude Darson, and it was either brilliant or insane, depending on whether you were reading the proposal in Paris or standing on Gibraltar watching its construction. Darson proposed floating batteries, not ordinary gun platforms, something entirely new. He would take 10 old warships and rebuild them into something that could not be destroyed. The side facing Gibraltar would be packed with layers of cork, rope, wet sand, and timber, 3 feet thick. Water tanks with elaborate piping systems ran through the holes so that any red-hot shot that embedded itself in the wood could be immediately doused before it ignited. The roofs were sloped and covered with wet hides to deflect British mortar shells. The largest carried 21 heavy cannon. Darson declared them fireproof, bomb-proof, and essentially indestructible. They were, he insisted, the mathematical certainty that would end this siege. The Spanish were convinced. Construction began in the Bay of Algeciras, visible across the water from Gibraltar's heights, throughout the spring and summer of 1782. Elliot watched the hulks being fitted and rebuilt through his telescope, and understood what he was watching. He requested large warships from London to counter them. London sent nothing. He began instead to install furnaces in every battery on Gibraltar, furnaces for heating cannonballs to red hot before firing. It was an old technique, dangerous to the gun crews who had to handle glowing iron with their bare hands' length, but devastating against wooden ships. The entire defense of the fortress was recalibrated around a single assumption. The floating batteries would come, and fire would stop them. The Count d'Artois arrived from Paris to watch the grand assault. He was Louis XVI's younger brother, a man of fashion and high expectation, and he had come to witness the surrender of Gibraltar. The Spanish spectators who gathered on the hillsides around the bay numbered in the thousands. Civilians who had been promised a spectacle, the final humiliation of the English, the recovery of the sacred rock. In Paris, there had even been an opera performed whose plot culminated in the triumphant capture of Gibraltar by the floating batteries. Darson was already famous before a single shot was fired. September 13th, 1782. The 10 floating batteries moved into position in the bay before Gibraltar's King's Bastion, towed into line by smaller vessels. Behind them, 18 ships of the line, 40 gunboats, 20 bomb ketches. On the shore, between 35,000 Spanish troops and 8,000 French, a total force of roughly 60,000 men against a garrison of 5,000. The batteries opened fire. Initially, the British guns made almost no impression. D'Arson's construction was holding. Shells exploded against the sloped roofs and bounced away. Cannonballs struck the packed timber and sand of the facing walls and failed to penetrate. The pumping systems worked, dousing any smoldering where shot had embedded itself. The garrison fired everything they had and watched it seem to accomplish nothing. For several hours, the situation looked genuinely desperate. It was possible that D'Arson had been right, that his batteries truly could not be destroyed. Then the furnaces reached temperature. It had taken until midday to heat enough shot to white heat. The process was slow and dangerous. Each glowing ball had to be carried from the furnace to the gun by two men working with iron frames, loaded with wet wadding to keep the heat from reaching the powder charge, and fired before it could set the barrel alight. A misstep meant the gun itself exploded, but when the red-hot shot began to land, something D'Arson had not fully accounted for became apparent. Heated iron does not just burn where it strikes. It burrows into timber and keeps burning, smoldering through wet sand and rope and cork until it reaches something that will ignite. The pumping systems could douse flames on the surface. They could not reach a glowing ball deep inside the hull. By late afternoon, two of the batteries were visibly on fire. By evening, the flames were beyond control. The pumps that were supposed to make the batteries indestructible were pumping onto fires they could not reach. D'Arson's engineering marvel was dying in the bay, and there was nothing to be done. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral de Cordova, sat at anchor in the outer bay and did nothing, never came in to rescue the burning batteries, never engaged the British. The men aboard the floating platforms, trapped as their ships burned around them, began jumping into the water. Captain Roger Curtis of the Royal Navy took gunboats out through the British lines and rescued 357 Spanish officers and men from the water. He was taking fire from his own guns as he did it. The rest, the crews who hadn't made it over the sides before the flames reached the powder, died when the magazines exploded. The blasts were visible across the bay, lighting up the hillsides where the civilian spectators had gathered to watch the surrender. They watched instead as all 10 floating batteries burned to the waterline and sank. D'Arson, ruined, spent the rest of his life writing pamphlets defending his design. The failures, he insisted, were not his. He was not entirely wrong. The batteries had performed as he predicted until the red-hot shot reached temperatures his water system could not counter. But the result was the result. The French and Spanish had lost 1,473 men in the Grand Assault. The British had lost 15 killed and 68 wounded. The Count d'Artois went home to Paris. The siege continued for another 5 months after the Grand Assault, because sieges have a terrible momentum that is difficult to stop, even after the point of failure has been reached. Spain and France could not admit defeat. There had been too much invested, too much money, too many men, too much national pride on public display. So the bombardment continued, and the garrison continued to absorb it, and both sides settled into the grim machinery of a siege that everyone with clear eyes could see was over. Admiral Richard Howe arrived in October 1782 with a final relief convoy, 34 ships of the line and 31 transports loaded with food, ammunition, and fresh troops. The combined French-Spanish fleet, 45 ships of the line, moved to intercept him. A gale scattered the blockading fleet at the critical moment. Howe sailed through, provisioned Gibraltar, and departed. The garrison had food again. There was nothing left to wait for. The peace preliminaries were signed on January 30th, 1783. The siege was officially lifted on February 5th. After 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days, it was over. The final accounting is worth sitting with. Spain and France had committed at various points over 40,000 troops and more than 100 warships to the siege. They had fired something approaching 500,000 rounds of shot at the rock. They had invented new weapons specifically to destroy it, constructed one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the history of artillery, and spent sums that contributed materially to France's financial crisis, the same crisis that would, 6 years later, help produce the French Revolution. And they had taken nothing. Gibraltar remained British. What Britain surrendered at the peace table was considerable. East and West Florida went to Spain, Minorca was ceded, France recovered its Caribbean islands. But Gibraltar stayed. Elliot had held it, and the peace treaty ratified what the canon could not change. George Eliot returned to England in 1787 to a reception that verged on the mythological. Parliament had already sent official thanks. He was made Baron Heathfield, a title that referenced the fortress he had defended. Joshua Reynolds painted his portrait, the gray-haired general leaning on a cannon, the Bay of Gibraltar visible behind him, holding the keys to the fortress in one hand. The painting went to the National Portrait Gallery. Monuments went to St. Paul's Cathedral. Streets were named for him. Songs were written. Mozart briefly sketched a cantata about the relief of Gibraltar. Before abandoning the project, the poem, it was said, wasn't to his taste. The siege tunnels that Sergeant Ince and his men carved through the rock during those years still exist. Tourists walk through them now, past the embrasures where guns once pointed down at the Spanish lines. The galleries run for miles through the limestone, an accidental monument to what happens when you give men with tools and nowhere to retreat enough time to work. By the end of the siege, the British had dug more than 1,000 feet of tunnel. By the end of the century, nearly 4,000 feet. The rock grew more fortified the longer it was attacked. The arithmetic never stopped being remarkable. 60,000 against 5,000. 500,000 rounds of shot. 10 floating batteries built by the finest military engineer in France, designed to be indestructible, burning to the waterline in a single afternoon. The siege was cited for the next century whenever anyone needed an example of what a small force could absorb and still refuse to quit. At Malta in 1942, the comparison was made explicitly by British commanders who knew the history. What it cost the garrison is harder to total. The official count was 1,231 men killed during the siege. Thousands more suffered scurvy, dysentery, the accumulated damage of years on short rations under regular bombardment. The town they lived in was rubble. The civilian population had largely been evacuated. They had spent 3.5 years in a place that was simultaneously their fortress and their trap, and they had come out on the other side of it. Spain would not try again. The obsession that had driven the 1779 siege gradually transformed over the following decades, first into alliance with Britain against Napoleon, then into a different kind of grievance, one conducted through diplomacy and border restrictions rather than cannon. The rock remained British. It still is. The legal basis is still the Treaty of Utrecht. The argument about its status still surfaces periodically in international forums and Spanish newspaper editorials and EU negotiations. The siege of 1779 failed so completely that it closed the military option for generations. Somewhere in the Gibraltar Museum there is a cannon from the siege, dark iron and patient. Next to it, or near it, or somewhere in the same building, depending on which account you read, is one of D'Arson's own plans for the floating batteries, the elegant engineering drawings of a weapon that was supposed to make this all so simple, the diagrams of water pipes and angled roofs and packed cork that were going to end the longest bet in the history of European fortification. The cannon won, 6,000 people, 2 miles of rock, 3.5 years, and 500,000 rounds of shot. Spain and France threw everything they had at a limestone peninsula, and the limestone held. The man on top of it slept 4 hours a night, ate vegetables, walked the lines in the dark, and waited them out. That is the story of the Great Siege of Gibraltar. Not the grand assault, or the floating batteries, or the famous sortie, though all of those matter. The story is the waiting, the 4-hour nights, the salt meat and the biscuit, and the men who kept showing up at their posts every morning, looking out at the bay, and refusing to be finished.